So I'm in the highly envious position of being right before lunch in a conference. This is also my first time speaking live and in person in a couple of years. So a few notes on that. I don't have my note slides as I get through anything. So I'll just ramble probably at some point. And also, I'm not wearing slippers for the first time in presenting in multiple years. I had to wear shoes with actual shoelaces, get a belt on. So I'm a little bit nervous right now, even though I've been presenting publicly for multiple years. When we counted down the SANS ICS summits, that 17, 16-ish number, I've been coming to about 10 of them. For the past 10 years, I've been coming to SANS ICS, and the past 4 of which I have actually been an instructor. So seeing the journey is one of the things that I want to be able to talk to you about, particularly around cyber risk, because we've done a really bad job of talking about it. So to get into that, well, first, I guess the awkward slide about my bio. Now, Tim thankfully prepared me to not have to talk too much about myself, but why am I here? What have I done? I would just basically say I've had a very lucky career. I've been lucky enough to be able to talk to executives while also going to the plants themselves, get lowered into manholes, and then have to dust myself off, put on a button up, and go talk to the executive about what the actual risk was. And I realized that our communication over that time just hasn't been all that great when we talk about risk. And I want to explore that a little bit more. If this is the first time you've heard me speak, whether you're in the room or you're online, there are a lot of other resources that may be able to catch you up to speed on some of the other presentations I've had and then sort of shaping my opinion on what it is that we do here and why it is that we're not so great at it. I did a talk on security metrics that we can do in ICS. As an engineer, I am very confident that we will solve the security metrics problem before the IT folks do, because if you get your engineers involved, they already do measurement. It's just a matter of how it is that we can leverage that when we talk about things like cybersecurity. I've also talked about how we could do this with cyber insurance initiatives. I presented at SANS in one of my first roles at Axio, talking about what we can do for insurance and linking that to the CFO, because the CFO has got the purse strings that allows us to have a better budget for some of this stuff. So as I go into this, just know that there's other materials that you could read, you could watch. This doesn't have to be like the end of your education on cyber risk once I get off stage. There's a lot of other things that you can do, and I'll plug you into more materials at the end of this talk as well. So the agenda, this is my SANS instructor hat wearing. I want to give you actually the learning objectives of what you're going to get over the next 30 minutes with me. The hypothesis that I have here is that threat-informed and scenario-based cyber risk management will enable executives and leaders to make cost-effective, timely, and impactful investments in ICS security. So let's break that down. I first want to visit with you what we mean by threat-informed and scenario-based. This is something that's a little bit different for us that we haven't quite gotten, I think, a really good handle on. I've been really impressed, though, throughout this entire time that we've been speaking over the past 2 days, to see multiple speakers talk about scenarios. That's relatively new, and I'll explain why when I uncover the story time over this presentation. We'll enable executives and leaders. I want you to be able to speak in business terms. I'll talk about executives, leaders. I'll talk about what they expect out of boardroom conversations and how you can then shape your dialogue to not mimic their discussion points, but learn to use their same lexicon so that we're using the same language whenever we're in the same boardroom. And then finally, to make impactful investments, what can we do with this information to actually make it actionable, not just have scenarios for the sake of having scenarios? To get there, I want to tell you a story. I'd like to unveil a story with Bob. Who is Bob? Bob is somebody that I've worked with over the past 15 years as a security leader. Bob, I'd say if you're familiar with like ever being interviewed by a journalist, Bob really wanted to tell his story, but he wanted to be on background and not on the record. So I am providing some of the context of that story because his employers would easily be able to identify his talk. And so what I'd like to be able to do is share the discussions that he and I have had over about a 10-year period. Actually, some of them happening not in this room, but within the SANS ICS summits, and where the evolution of his journey has gone as a leader. To start off, we'll go back 10 years ago, where he was identified as a new OT security leader at an asset owning organization, an industrial firm. And on paper in 2012, if you think about like where we were as an industry, we did not have a whole lot of training for people to do ICS security. We didn't have a whole lot of fundamental knowledge outside of, well, we've been doing this for the past 10, 20 years as experts, as gurus, but we couldn't say things like, well, I am a GICSP certified cybersecurity professional, which has a little bit more of a nice, fancier ring to it than I am a cybersecurity ninja with real kung fu grip. That doesn't really jive as well, right? So we were back in a time where most of the leaders in the space came from maybe the federal side, which is where Bob came from maybe military, Department of Defense side, because they did cyber risk, they did cybersecurity for these systems very well. They already had to do it. They had mandatory things that they had to do. They had to be able to get the budgets for those. They had to train people on them. So when you think about a leader in the space 10 years ago, the background typically looks like somebody who came from the military, somebody who came from the government, who said, hey, no, I've done this before on these federal systems. I can apply it to your private sector systems. So everyone, when he finally moved over to the private sector side, was like, whoa, he has got this in the bag. He's got the right background. He has the right capabilities. This is going to be a cakewalk. Fast forward about 6 years. The board starts getting very invested in ICS security. Things have already become apparent over the previous years, like the Ukraine incident, like Trisis incident, that there are attackers focusing on operations. And this questions became really awkward of, well, where have we been investing all of our money for cybersecurity? On phishing attempts, on the IT side, not necessarily on the OT side, where operations really matter. So the board asked the question, hey, what's our cybersecurity profile look like for OT? Bob said, oh, I got this, because I've been trained in the NIST cybersecurity framework, and I'm going to show you this equation right here, that cyber risk is equal to consequence times threat times vulnerability. I can't see the thousands of people online, but from the people in the room, how many of you have used this equation before? How many of you are still using this equation? Okay, all right. So I'll talk about why this equation is not so great, because what followed next was an absolute disaster in the boardroom. And why? Well, when we break down this equation, first, the definition for cyber risk is actually, it's not a bad one. You can see right here, the potential loss of life, injury, damage to assets, financial loss, and other harm from the failure or misuse of digital technology and communication networks used for information and or operational capabilities. I can make ICS fit in that. Talking about loss of life, injury, that's industrial cyber risk. That sounds great. Does this equation answer that set of definitional phrases? Not really. And furthermore, this like phrase itself going through this equation sucks. Because look at this equation itself. If I break down some of the components, let's just say, let's put consequence to the side for a second. There's been a lot of great talks in consequence so far. You're going to get a lot more by the end of the day. Let's talk about threat. Are threats decreasing? Do we have less threat actors today in industrial control systems than we did yesterday? Increasing. How about vulnerabilities? We're obviously doing better with that, right? Those are decreasing all the time. Where on your sort of high school math hat, what happens when I take two ever increasing slopes and multiply them by each other? This equation becomes unsolvable. This looks horrible. You go to a board and you describe the elements of this equation and they say, well, how do you manage this thing? This looks like I can't control the threats. I could do some things with vulnerabilities. We'll dive into that in a second. But that means I have at least one thing always increasing. What am I going to do in this case? The equation itself doesn't even set us up for the right conversation points to have with these executives. And then the other failure that ran into on this approach was using an asset-based risk assessment. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm actually really glad that Jeff got to go and do the demo before me, because one of the things that you see in the very first part of that is your asset inventories. Your asset inventories, though, should also include your data inventories, which we don't really do a good job on. But let's say we have all of that. Like we have all the inventories that we ever need. And then we say, well, we're going to classify these based off of CIA, AIC. I don't care which one you're going to use. But you say, okay, Mr. Executive, don't worry. We have gone through and we've classified all our assets, and the high availability ones mean what for our risk, mean what for our consequence. We say that asset has to be high availability. And then I times it by threat, times it by vulnerability. What is the actual equation give you at the end of the day that makes an executive say, I can use this to then get more investment out of it? It became really murky. It becomes really difficult. This is a good thought exercise. The classification of assets is really important, but the classification of assets does not mean that we are doing anything with risk. It allows us to have a good understanding of maybe what controls should be in place, but that is not a risk-based discussion that you're actually having. So you fast forward, it took Bob a while, but Bob started climbing out of this hole. The board meeting went horrific. There was yelling, there was, I don't believe that you know what you're doing. There was a lot of trust that then had to get recaptured. And then part of that, and this is the discussions that we were having over the past couple of years, was how do we redefine that problem set? How do we make this more solvable for folks? To quote his peers, what happened was a scary thought that this could happen to any of us who were sort of trained and operated under this old framework of doing things. And if you're invited to that board meeting, you put your foot in your mouth, it's really hard to gain that trust back. Trust is the easiest thing to lose when it demonstrates that you may not know exactly what you're talking about. And our education, the processes that we adapted from IT, didn't set a lot of those folks up for success. So I want to talk about the two different paths for evaluating risk and where this sort of pivots from and how to climb out of this hole, especially if you find yourself in it, which is really great to see some people, like a lot of those hands that were up went down. I was like, oh, I don't use this equation anymore. And it's no wonder as to why. But what could you do instead? Well, the asset-based approach that I just described is where you take that full inventory, you kind of examine where those vulnerabilities are. And the way that I would describe it is you'd always hear back with that old equation that threat is equal to a 1. And what it did was it was a pendulum swing. Because if we said that threat is equal to 1 or 100% in this equation, what does that force you then to focus on nonstop? Vulnerabilities. It's the only other part of the equation that you think you can control. So we started having this swing of the pendulum where everyone's trying to do vulnerability management. Everyone's trying to whack-a-mole on what is the latest patch we need to be able to put in. We're trying to talk about ICS and where we can't patch these things on a regular basis. And so it led us down this really difficult path when we did the asset-based by itself. Scenario-based turned out to be far superior for us in the ICS space. And I would actually argue in IT as well. But for us in ICS, what we could then do is say, well, what is the actual effect that a threat adversary would go after? What is the really bad day look like for us? And how can we help enumerate or quantify that a little bit better? And scenario-based really helped us out with that. So there were pros and cons to both. I don't say throw out the asset-based areas. If you're doing asset-based, that will give you some more tactical approaches to things. It's really good if you already have that well-defined asset inventory, including data assets. So if you have that, great. It gives you that granular perspective. You can do what I'd say are more geared towards vulnerability assessments than necessarily risk assessments, but you're at least able to get tactical information to move forward with. But what are the negatives on that? You have to have a well-defined asset inventory and those data elements. So everything that Jeff and Jason were up here demonstrating about those classifications of data, that better be part of your actually IT, OT data asset inventories, because you need those to be able to understand how to respond and recover. And a lot of folks are definitely missing out on that. Also, when you only do asset-based, you kind of ignore your interdependencies. You only look at the asset itself. And you find a lot of people struggling with that. Oh, well, that firewall over there is a 0.2 value. Out of what? What does that mean? It doesn't, again, allow you to maybe extrapolate that into what does this mean for the business? Could that lead to an outage? Is there something that may impact property damages or health and human life? We then get into scenario-based. So scenario-based, what it'll do is it actually allows us to ingest things that we may already be doing in our ICS space, like getting threat information. A lot of folks are getting threat information at a tactical level. Building scenarios will then help you raise it up to a business level. It'll also allow you to take the things that maybe you see in this asset-based approach and actually make it actionable for your executives. And then you can directly apply that to strategic initiatives. And the great thing about scenario-based is it doesn't have to be death by data. You can do things like workshop-based, similar to tabletops, where instead of talking about how would we respond, you could say, how much is that going to cost? What are those impacts going to be? And that starts elevating the conversation quite a bit more to that business speak that you want to find yourself on. The downside is it does require some culture shifts. It requires your subject matter experts, for example, to have buy-in. The number one thing that we'll talk to them about is where do you get plausible scenarios from? And a lot of the times they'll fight the scenarios. And you want to get that input in there, but at the same point, you want to be able to bring them to a conversation about what the real world impacts could be that would impact their day jobs. And you could miss some really granular details. So combining both is really the best approach, but for the longest time, again, pendulum swing, we've been focusing on asset-based only. That includes our vulnerability assessments, that includes what's the risk to this device, not necessarily what's the risk to operations. So as Bob was sort of evaluating how to change this approach, some of the things that he was looking for was, well, how could I bring controls into that conversation? Get sort of a comprehensive idea of real life things that could help me with my actual risks. The countermeasures, if we think about like a bow tie diagram, for those of you who are engineers in the room, when we think about the countermeasures that could be in place to help us out there. Some of the other challenges was scoping for adequate coverage. Bob had several lines of business. If you talk about ransomware, does ransomware go across all those lines of business? Does it only impact corporate? Would it go and try to mix into different areas that we'd be concerned about? How do I make sure that I've got scenarios that cover every single thing that I do as an industrial organization? And it also did help out with response preparedness. So he brought in the folks that were doing tabletop exercises to be able to say, okay, what were the scenarios that we ran through over the past 5 years? Oh, those are really cool scenarios. Did we ever say to the executive suite what that would actually impact us for? We talked about how we could respond and recover for it, but what would be the end of day like deliverable? How many dollars of impact? Do we lose any lives during that impact? Did we lose a turbine? What was the actual thing that we should really care about from that operational perspective, and producing that in a risk report, not in an incident response tabletop report? And then also talk about the risk drivers and the control effectiveness so that we could start driving for, again, increased impacts to what it is that we're investing in. And that was one of the things that he really wanted to focus on. And doing the scenario-based really helped out with that. There were two different approaches to looking at scenario-based. One would be historic, one would be hypothetical. Historic is pretty easy to do. You kind of just look at the news, you look at recent events. It'll be a little bit of a lagging indicator, but you can go through and understand what somebody else maybe have gone through and then apply it to your own operations. Hypothetical requires you to think outside the box, requires you to work with your engineers, work with your operators and say, what does a really bad day look like for you? Just start there. If you start with that one question, I highly recommend, again, maybe a workshop, maybe you bring donuts and coffee. They'll tell you what the really bad day looks like. And then you can start looping that into where have you put your cyber defenses and how are you having these conversations. If you're doing industrial cyber risk management, you need to absolutely do both. Because if you're only looking at historical, you're looking at things that have impacted others in the past. If you start looking at plausibility and things that are going to be hypothetical, you may not be considering all the historic reference things that are happening today. So with that, historic, again, pretty easy. Let's say you want to talk about what happened at Norsk Hydro. You can go through what a ransomware event could look like inside your operations. Let's say you want to examine NotPetya. There's a lot of good numbers and figures about sort of organizations that were impacted by that in the dollar values because they had to file things with their SEC filings that demonstrated, hey, this could be a $350 million event. Maybe we want to evaluate what that would look like for us, even though we weren't hit with it. Maybe you want to look at what happened at Oldsmar, being able to see how would your operators respond to an event like that. Or something that's safety related, like the Trisis attack, or even what's happened in the Ukraine over the past few years. You could take historical things and apply them to your operations. And that will give you, again, a more robust idea of a risk register to understand how it is this will impact you, and therefore what it is that you can inform your board about that's based off of real world events. Hypothetical, that's where the fun really is. So for hypothetical, what you want to do is you want to think like an attacker, which means you need to take your threat intel people if you have them. If not, you could go ahead and read a whole lot of reports. You could work with people who maybe done this before to understand what a bad guy thinks like, to then try to figure out what those worst impacts are. So then you take in your engineers and your operators and you, again, ask that question, what does a really bad day look like for you? And you start then building out, well, what can we do about resilience in that case? Do I have passive safety systems involved? Do I have different countermeasures on the cybersecurity side that would allow me to detect this quicker or even prevent it? And if so, then that scenario probably gets tossed out. But you're at least doing this brainstorming that's allowing you to get to what that ground truth could look like. So the first thing is think like an attacker. So I'm going to use the Trisis event because this is one of the things that, again, propelled Bob into that board meeting to begin with, to be able to have a conversation about, well, what would a safety-based attack look like? If somebody went after our safety instrumented system, our SISs, what would that look like for us? So the very first thing he did, he broke open a report that happened to have a Xenotime, which is a threat actor that was identified by Dragos, and went through the diamond model with it to be able to understand, well, what was the infrastructure that was being leveraged, compromised vendor VPN, command and control infrastructure adversary compromised, legitimate owned, the capabilities that they had in place, the complex malware that was used for interacting actually with the SIS, living off the land, so not actually necessarily understanding or seeing them because they look like legitimate users, compromising the OT and then moving into the SIS and leaving to come back with a targeted attack at the SIS. There are capabilities there. You can measure those capabilities. You can enumerate them. You can examine those. You could even put detections in place so you could try to find those. That's really great for having a risk management conversation. And of course, the victim part of the diamond that you see here would be petrochemical, and in particular to geographic, whether or not you're in Saudi, US, and other countries that have been identified. So the Xenotime report actually has all of that listed in there. And if you're using threat information to start saying, well, are these scenarios plausible for me? Well, yes. If I am in this victimology, if I can see this traffic possibly happening, I have an SIS like this, I should probably evaluate this as a risk. It seems like a good idea for us to be able to understand how this could impact us in the real world. And also thinking like an attacker. So I actually love that yesterday was a conversation about MITRE ATT&CK because I don't have to go through this entire slide. But this is really great for you to be able to, again, enumerate things that are happening that could be how you could say, well, is a threat adversary have capability? Are they motivated? What are the different aspects here that we could then identify in our networks if there were to be an attack? This allows you to speak educatedly about the threat actor, which means that you can start quantifying some of those movements and some of those patterns to allow you to have a conversation with executives. It's not just threats are increasing. Yes, threats are increasing. What are the capabilities that the threat actor has? The threat actor looking at us from a victimology perspective. It's a little bit of a lagging indicator, I will admit that, but it's better than just saying, well, have you seen that we have more threat actors today than we did yesterday? That's not going to go very far, but this gives you more analysis that you can perform. You're doing your homework now as part of that equation. And then defending the crown jewels itself. So the crown jewels approach, you can see here, there's actually a white paper on here from Dragos that we've done where we've sort of drilled down into what do we say that we do here as an organization? What's a critical system or subsystem that we want to be able to look at? And then get down to those critical components to then understand, well, what are the controllers that are actually involved that allows us to operate? And we get them to these crown jewels and we can start having conversations of saying, okay, based off those crown jewels, what happens if there's loss of visibility, loss of control, manipulation of safety? How can we then identify those to go a little bit further? And you bring that back then into business talk. So this was the conversation I had last year where I wanted to be able to show you that you could quantify these things pretty easily from an impact perspective. And somebody in your organization has already done this homework. They've already said what a high and low impact look like. For ICS, we're a little bit different because you want to be able to look at these 5 different factors: financial, safety, business continuity, environmental impacts, reputational, and because of critical infrastructure, absolutely national security impacts. And you can start saying, well, for very low things, we don't care about anything that's below $250,000 maybe, to things that may be very high, $200 million. But if you can start measuring these things and start saying, well, what would the impact actually be in business terms? This allows you to then go to that executive suite and get, again, a little bit more granular with your discussion and have a little bit more of a cost benefit analysis that could be an approach to it at the end of the day. So creating these hypotheticals, a couple of ways of doing it. You could do sort of one massive scenario, which I think is what most people like to be able to do, the doomsday thing that happens. You could do multiple sort of stacking scenarios that lead to that really, really bad day. You could also go for smaller ones. You can go for like sort of the death by 1,000 cuts approach. You've had slow trickle of different incidents that have happened over the period of a year, or even massive succession. How quickly can your team adapt to that? One of the resources that I worked in one of my previous jobs at Electric Power Research Institute was failure scenarios for the electric sector. Headed by Annabelle Lee and others, there were some great conversations about already predefined scenarios. And so in the electric sector, I wanted to provide an example of what that could look like. In this case here, a threat actor causes chemical spill using a vendor remote access. A representative of a vendor contracted to manage inventory and chemistry within our generation plant has remote logical access through an insecure cellular connection. That would never happen in real life, right? Remote access grants configuration control to the storage tank level instrumentation signals, day tank levels, and pump settings. A threat agent utilizes the cellular connection to access the system and modify the level indication, causing the tanks to be overfilled with hazardous chemicals. You can then look at that and say, okay, well, what are those impacts going to be for us? Hazardous chemical spill of any size have to be reported for regulatory purposes. Personnel and equipment are endangered by the uncontrolled hazardous chemical release. You can internalize this. You can look at this from your own plant operations and say, is this plausible? Is this something that we would be concerned with? And are these the type of impacts that would be facing as a result? If the answer is yes, then go through those 5 characteristics I showed you previously, rank every single one of them and say, you know what, financially, this would be moderate, but safety, that could be pretty high. Business continuity, we could still run. National security impacts won't be there, but environmental impacts, those would be high. Reputational impacts too, local newspaper picking that up, that would also be high. And you can start then quantifying this or qualifying this a little bit better in business terms. So we've taken a scenario about a real threat actor that you would be able to quantify using things like the attack framework. Now we're looking at impacts. We can start saying, what does this mean in terms of the business to get us to something that we can then present to executives to get them to perform action. And what would that look like? You want to look then at your resilience. This is the last stage that Bob really found himself in, understanding that just because you have a bad actor out there doesn't mean you're going to have a bad day. What are the things that we naturally have in place? Well, if you're in chemical, perhaps, for example, you're doing PHAs, process hazard analyses. You could take those and analyze them. Can this be done from a cybersecurity perspective? If yes, that PHA, that entire set of impacts that engineers have already done and looked at, all of a sudden become mine. I now need to be worried about that from a cybersecurity perspective. Maybe you have business impact analyses. Maybe you're not part of a chemical sector. So you use BIAs, business impact analyses, that tell you, well, what are your recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives you have for your different processes? Or maybe you want to be able to leverage your SILs. What are you already planning for what you're doing in safety instrument systems, for example? Where are your safety nets that are already, again, engineered, passive safety elements that are already engineered that could help you out with resilience and being able to quantify that? Maybe it's as simple as talking about manual operations, the way that we already do business. And so there are already ways that we've built this into ICS that engineers and operators are already doing, that their defenses become your defenses in this journey as well. So if I take that same example, this is actually also in the NESCOR documentation. You can see here, potential mitigations are already listed out. Generate alerts for DCS configuration changes. Create audit logs to track system configuration modifications. Detect remote access traffic in the DCS. Restrict configuration access to limit who has access and can make configuration changes. Require two-person rule configuration changes to be included as a local resource. And build a defensible DCS architecture. You already have, in this case, a resource that's giving you the attack scenario, the mitigations that could be in place, and you can then start building that out to be a little bit better and start having a conversation about this new risk equation, where we could take the same things that we talked about before. We have threats now. We can look at the diamond model. We can look at MITRE ATT&CK. We can enumerate something there. We can start talking about capabilities, talking about the things that we know are part of this equation or should at least be part of the scenario itself. Vulnerabilities. I actually like the fact that Eric is already doing a vulnerability conversation with SBOM. Vulnerabilities are publicly out there. However, if you're just looking at things that are, for example, on ICS cert alerts, you're going to be missing the things that may happen systemically, the things that are just part of your processes that you may be missing. It's not, again, driven by the asset in all cases. Scenarios could be a weakness in the way that you process something, in the way that your program is set up or your architecture itself. And then resilience, understanding that we can do things like manual operation, we have passive safety elements. You can build out this part of the equation. So it's not that you're constantly increasing on threat and vulnerability. If you increase resilience, you find that that overall factor on that right-hand side can decrease. And that impact is looking at things that are in business terms. When Bob got to this point, he could realize that this was now stoppable. This was something that you could actually present to executives and be meaningful with. Which gets us to our last part. How do you communicate with the board? So a couple of things going into this. One, despite what you heard, executives are smart. A lot of times we like to say, well, they don't understand what's going on. They're smart in their field. They know how to run an organization. They don't know everything about cybersecurity. And frankly, they're not supposed to. It's up to you to meet them where they are. They're not going to come to you. So you have to adapt these things like business speak, like impact, to be able to drive these scenarios forward. Keep it simple and tell a story. Be able to talk through things like scenarios, like threat actors and their capabilities and the things that are increasing. Death by data is just death by extra words. Do not try to overwhelm them with your presentation about how smart you are. You've got your homework in the background. Be able to show them something that's a little bit more simple in that. And be prepared to fail fast and try again. This is one of the things that I see time and time again. You're not going to get this right the first time. Most people do not. The best words of advice I can give you is to find somebody else who already does present on risk, like maybe the chief financial officer or the chief operating officer, and use their type of report metrics. Okay, so smart, simple, fast. That means don't go in front of your execs and show them the entire MITRE ATT&CK framework. That's not going to go over very well. And it does mean that you can simplify some of those things. So I showed you that first risk equation. I showed you a second one. And now getting to this one, maybe we just say that factor of threat, vulnerability, and resilience is something we call susceptibility. That makes it very easy for an executive to understand. Here is our impact, our consequence. Here is how we are susceptible to that potential scenario. And how much data do you really need to show? Well, I'll show you what Bob ended up doing. Same question, same board, a few years later. What's our cyber risk profile look like? Based on our current threats and susceptibility, our team is most concerned about the following risk scenario, which can be further mitigated by investing in new controls. And you can see here, very simple. What is the risk? What are the main countermeasures in place? And what are those impacts? All that homework I showed you, Bob had in a folder ready to be able to brief on. This report template was actually used by his CFO. He just used the exact same thing that they already knew how to look at metrics for and adapted it to cybersecurity. So when he talks about risk right after the CFO, it looks like they're using the same report, the same metrics, and they are. And they're able to talk to the board in sort of a uniform fashion, as opposed to 50,000 attacks, we're code red. Nobody wants to hear that because it doesn't really mean anything to you. If you can start talking about business impacts, though, that drives the conversation forward. All right, so a couple last points. What can you do with these scenarios? Quite a few things that we actually addressed earlier yesterday with regards to how could you use scenarios for other things, like driving cost benefit analysis, like training on realistic scenarios for your teams, or performing threat hunting. Presume that you've been compromised, build a set of hypotheses, and look for the bad actors based off your risk scenarios. That really gives you a bulletproof defense then when you go in front of executives to say, we know how much this event would cost us. We know what the controls would cost us to prevent this thing, and we're actively looking for adversaries that may be doing harm to us. That is a bulletproof messaging that allows you to say, we are managing this problem. And my last note, change is coming. If you are not plugged into the SEC, which I don't believe many of us would be, they're actually going through a filing attempt right now to be able to say that boards and executives need to address cyber risk head on. You can see here that the board must demand cyber risk indicators be presented in financial and economic terms so they can effectively compare to other risks and priorities in the company. This will be for publicly traded companies that obviously include industrials, and I'd expect to see a ripple effect from here. If you need more information, there's a white paper that we wrote at Dragos a year ago on industrial cyber risk management. Risk scenarios from ISACA is another really good conversation point to have, as well as some conversations from SEI on how to create different threat reports and scenarios, as well as what we cover in ICS 418, which thank you, Tim, for being able to talk about that. That is our new 2-day course, just focusing on managers and how they can solve these problems that I just showed you. And with that, I am happy to open the floor to questions.